In 1918, the war wasn't the only thing killing people. You could wake up in the morning with a scratchy throat, nothing dramatic. By nightfall, your body would be on fire. Fever, crushing aches, a cough that turned wet, then violent. And then, in the worst cases, something far more terrifying. The skin around the mouth and fingertips darkening as the lungs filled and the body began to suffocate from the inside. Hospitals overflowed. Nurses ran out of beds, then out of masks, then out of time. Entire households went quiet. The dead were carried out so fast that funerals became impossible. And in many cities, life itself started to feel like a thin performance held together by routine and denial. Across the world, it spread through troop trains, crowded barracks, ports, factories, and schools, moving faster than governments could admit and faster than medicine could explain. By the time it finally burned down, it had infected roughly a third of the planet and killed tens of millions of people. History remembers it by the wrong name, the Spanish flu. Not because it began in Spain, but because Spain, neutral in World War I, reported openly while many warring nations censored bad news to protect morale. So the world saw Spanish headlines and assumed Spain was the source. This was the 1918 influenza pandemic, caused by an H1N1 influenza A virus, and it was the most severe influenza pandemic of the modern era. And to understand how something so vast could happen so quickly, we have to start with the world that unknowingly built the perfect machine for it to travel. In most people's imagination, pandemics belong to the distant past. Muddy streets, medieval fear, ignorance written into stone. But in 1918, the world was not isolated. It was modern enough to move men and materials at industrial speed, and still fragile enough to be blindsided by a virus. World War I had turned entire nations into logistics engines. Millions of soldiers were mobilized, packed into training camps, trenches, troop trains, and transport ships. Crowded spaces where respiratory disease spreads with ruthless efficiency. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited medical capacity weren't side details of the war. They were the environment the pandemic needed. And the routes were already built. Rail lines stitched cities to ports. Steamships stitched continents to one another. When the influenza appeared and began circulating widely, it didn't have to find a way across borders. The way was scheduled. Departures were timetabled. The world's arteries were already open. What makes this especially dangerous is that the first wave in early 1918 did not initially look like the apocalypse we now associate with the Spanish flu. In the spring, the virus was widely described as comparatively ordinary influenza, widespread, disruptive, but not yet the mass killer it would become. In the United States, early outbreaks were identified among military personnel in the spring of 1918, and the disease moved wherever those soldiers moved. That normality was deceptive, because wartime governments had strong incentives to keep morale intact. Bad news traveled slowly when it was politically inconvenient, and openly when it wasn't. Neutral Spain reported freely, so the world saw Spain's headlines first, and the nicknames stuck. So by the time people realized this wasn't just another seasonal wave, the machinery of war and commerce had already done its work. The stage was set. The audience just didn't know what kind of tragedy they were watching. Yet. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We still don't have a single, universally agreed day zero for the 1918 pandemic. Not because historians haven't looked, because the world of 1918 made clean answers hard to find. Wartime censorship muted reporting in many countries. Medical diagnostics were limited, and influenza moves like smoke. It appears in clusters, vanishes, then reappears somewhere else, leaving behind ambiguity that looks, in hindsight, like mystery. Even today, major references emphasize that the exact geographic origin remains uncertain. What we can say with high confidence is this. In the spring of 1918, influenza outbreaks were first clearly identified in US military personnel, and one of the most frequently cited early flashpoints was Camp Funston at Fort Riley, Kansas, where a large cluster of soldiers fell ill in early March 1918. From there, the logic of war took over. Camp Funston wasn't an isolated town outbreak. It was a node in a living network. Soldiers trained, transferred, boarded trains, and shipped out. The virus traveled with them to other camps, then to ports, then across the Atlantic with troops and cargo moving into Europe. By the following months, influenza activity was being observed across multiple regions, spreading along transportation routes and through crowded military and urban settings. And in that first phase, what many historians describe as the initial wave, the pandemic often looked, at least on the surface, like influenza had always looked. Widespread, exhausting, disruptive, but not yet the planet-shaking killer it would soon become. That apparent mildness created a deadly illusion. Because while people argued about where it started and whether it was just the flu, the virus was quietly positioning itself inside the largest mass movement of human beings the modern world had ever organized. And then, later in 1918, it would change. Then, in late summer of 1918, the story changed. In many places, a far deadlier second wave erupted, often dated to August to October 1918, and it hit with a violence that made the spring outbreaks feel like a false calm. Patients who seemed merely sick in the morning could deteriorate into severe pneumonia with terrifying speed. In the most lethal outbreaks, death could come within days, sometimes sooner, once the lungs were overwhelmed. This is the phase that burned the pandemic into memory. And it wasn't only the scale, it was who it killed. Typical influenza mortality is U-shaped. The very young and the very old die at the highest rates. But the 1918 pandemic produced a famous anomaly, a W-shaped mortality pattern, with an additional striking peak among young adults, especially roughly ages 20 to 40. That is one of the defining epidemiological signatures of 1918. Why the second wave was so lethal is still studied, and no single sentence captures it honestly. But the evidence supports a few hard points. First, the world in 1918 had no antibiotics, so when influenza damaged the respiratory tract, secondary bacterial pneumonia often became the final, fatal blow. Modern reviews of 1918 repeatedly emphasize that many deaths were associated with these bacterial complications rather than influenza alone. Second, the virus itself, an influenza A H1N1 virus, was capable of extraordinary severity, and the medical system of the time had little ability to support patients through respiratory failure. And third, the very machinery that powered the war, crowded transport, crowded housing, constant movement, didn't just spread the virus, it increased the odds that people encountered it at the worst possible moment, exhausted, malnourished, stressed, and packed into indoor air they couldn't escape. The second wave didn't just infect populations, it crashed through them, and it did it with a cruelty that made the pandemic feel less like illness and more like a force. By the time the second wave arrived, the pandemic didn't need to break into the modern world. It was already inside the system that moved the modern world. In the United States, public health records and later reconstructions place one of the most visible early surges of the second wave around the Boston area, including a naval facility in Boston and Camp Devens, an army training camp just outside the city. From there, outbreaks followed the logic of movement, military sites, rail corridors, and dense cities where people were already packed together by war industry and everyday necessity. And this is where the story becomes brutally consistent.
Because in 1918, cities were not just population centers. They were junctions where ships unloaded, trains arrived, and crowds compressed into streetcars, factories, and tenements. Once influenza entered those junctions, it could radiate outward faster than local authorities could coordinate a response. Officials did act, but the actions were fragmented, uneven, and often late. Across American cities, the main tools were what we'd now call non-pharmaceutical interventions, isolating the sick, quarantining contacts, closing schools, and canceling mass gatherings. A major historical analysis of US cities grouped those interventions into 3 core categories: school closure, cancellation of public gatherings, and isolation quarantine, and then compared how timing and layering affected outcomes. The pattern that emerges is simple
and devastating. When cities moved early, before death rates exploded, they tended to reduce the peak and stretch the curve. When they hesitated, when parades continued, theaters stayed open, crowds kept flowing, the virus didn't just spread, it spiked. And when measures were lifted too soon, second peaks became more likely. But even the best policies were fighting physics. In 1918, there was no way to reliably test and trace. No ventilators, no antibiotics for the bacterial pneumonia that so often followed. Hospitals could be overwhelmed in days, and once the clinical system buckled, fear itself became a vector, driving people to flee, to hide illness, or to crowd together in places that felt safe, even when they were not. So the second wave did what the first could not. It turned transportation networks into a delivery mechanism and city life into fuel. And once that happened, the pandemic didn't just move across the map, it moved through the basic routines that made society function. By September and October of 1918, the pandemic stopped feeling like a public health problem and started behaving like a city-wide system failure. In some places, the timeline was almost cruel in how quickly it accelerated. In Philadelphia, influenza was identified at the Navy Yard on September 18, 1918, and by the next day, hundreds of sailors were sick, with civilian patients arriving at hospitals immediately afterward. That is what the second wave looked like in real time. Not a gradual rise, but a sudden flood. Hospitals filled first, then corridors, then stairwells, then whatever buildings could be converted into something close to a ward. In Philadelphia, when hospitals were overwhelmed, the city opened dozens of temporary emergency hospitals in spaces like schools, warehouses, and churches, because there simply weren't enough beds, staff, or oxygen for the volume of patients. And it wasn't only space, it was people. Nursing staff were stretched past normal limits, working long shifts in conditions that were physically exhausting and psychologically grinding. Rows of coughing patients, constant fever management, and the relentless arithmetic of triage, who might recover and who was slipping away. Inside the body, the second wave could be terrifyingly fast. Clinicians described patients whose color changed, an ominous blue darkening at the edges as their lungs failed. Later medical accounts note that the influenza pneumonias could be so violent that, at autopsy, investigators compared the lung damage to what they had seen in victims of poison gas. Worse still, 1918 medicine was missing critical tools. There were no antibiotics, and many fatal cases were tied to secondary bacterial pneumonia that followed the initial viral infection, an aftershock that doctors could recognize but not reliably stop. So daily life began to contort around the emergency. Schools closed in some cities, public gatherings were restricted in others. Work continued where it had to, war production did not pause easily, but whole neighborhoods moved as if they were holding their breath. And for a brutal stretch of weeks, death clustered densely in time. The pandemic's most lethal period in many regions was concentrated in the fall of 1918, when the second wave peaked. In the streets, it looked like a strange quiet. Indoors, it looked like overcrowded rooms, exhausted nurses, and families trying to care for the sick with almost nothing except water, blankets, and hope. And when a society reaches that point, when care runs out before illness does, panic stops being an emotion. It becomes infrastructure. By late 1918, in many places, the worst seemed to be passing, almost like a storm finally moving offshore. But pandemics rarely end with a clean exit. A third wave surged in early 1919, and while it was generally less catastrophic than the fall peak, it reminded survivors of a grim truth. Influenza can return, and it can return fast. The CDC's historical summaries describe 3 waves, with the third wave subsiding during the summer of 1919. Only after these waves did the scale come fully into view. Modern estimates agree on the broad contours, even if the exact total will never be known with precision. The CDC states that about 500 million people, roughly 1/3 of the world's population at the time, were infected, and that the pandemic resulted in at least 50 million deaths worldwide. Scholarly reviews likewise emphasize the enormous attack rate and the pandemic's exceptional mortality, while noting uncertainty in exact global totals. In the United States, commonly cited estimates place deaths around 675,000, a figure frequently used in public history summaries of the pandemic. And when the bodies stopped arriving, the damage didn't simply vanish. A world already exhausted by war stepped into an uneasy peace, carrying mass bereavement, disrupted economies, and the quieter scars that don't show up in statistics. Missing parents, missing workers, empty classrooms, and communities trying to return to normal while knowing normal had failed them. When the 1918 pandemic finally loosened its grip, the world tried to move on, because it had to. But the virus had left behind more than empty beds and fresh graves. It left a new kind of knowledge, that in a connected society, speed is destiny, and delay is a decision, even when it doesn't feel like one. Decades later, researchers would look back at American cities and find a consistent pattern. Places that layered interventions, closing schools, cancelling public gatherings, isolating and quarantining cases, earlier tended to reduce peak mortality and blunt the worst of the wave. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't modern medicine. But it was proof that human behavior and public policy can shape the arc of a pandemic. It also left another lesson, quieter but just as powerful. Information matters. The world called it the Spanish flu, not because Spain unleashed it, but because Spain's press, less constrained by wartime censorship, reported what others hid. The name itself became a reminder that in crisis, silence doesn't stop disease. It only helps it travel. And if any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, waves that rise and fall, hospitals that strain, masks and closures, and arguments about what to report and when, then the final lesson is the hardest one. Pandemics do not repeat in identical form, but the test repeats. In 1918, the world failed that test in the beginning, then learned, painfully, in public. And the world we live in now is still built on the same fragile truth they discovered too late. A virus doesn't need permission. It only needs a path.